The disappearance of Helen Marie Patterson, a cold case desk investigation. The notification appeared on Detective Richard Morgan's computer screen at exactly 9:32 a.m. on a cold Monday morning in February 2024. After 23 years working cold cases for the Pennsylvania State Police, he had learned to recognize the weight of certain moments before they fully registered in his conscious mind. The CODIS database match had been sitting in his inbox for less than 5 minutes, but something about the case number made him pause. Patterson, Helen Marie, missing since October 3, 1958, file last updated 2021. Morgan leaned back in his chair, the fluorescent lights of the Harrisburg headquarters casting harsh shadows across the manila folders that perpetually cluttered his desk. 66 years. He had worked cases that stretched back decades, but nothing quite like this. In 1958, DNA was still purely theoretical, locked away in university laboratories. The double helix had been decoded just 5 years earlier, but the idea that microscopic genetic material could solve crimes belonged to the realm of science fiction. Yet here on his monitor was irrefutable proof that William Francis Garrett's DNA matched biological evidence collected from a 13-year-old girl's torn dress in rural Ashford County, Pennsylvania, more than 6 decades ago. The match shouldn't have been possible. Garrett had died 4 years earlier in 2020, his saliva collected during a routine arrest for aggravated assault in Allegheny County. His genetic profile had been entered into the system posthumously when Pennsylvania expanded its DNA collection protocols. The Patterson evidence had been digitized only in 2022, part of a massive cold case initiative that processed thousands of forgotten samples using new extraction techniques that could recover genetic material from fabric fragments and microscopic traces that previous technology couldn't detect. Morgan pulled up Helen Patterson's file, watching the sepia-toned photographs load with agonizing slowness on his outdated system. A young face stared back at him from a school portrait taken just weeks before the disappearance. Helen had been an 8th grader at Ashford County Junior High School, honor student, daughter of coal miner Thomas Patterson and homemaker Catherine Patterson. She had vanished on a Friday afternoon, walking home from school along the same tree-lined route she had taken every day for 2 years. If you're following this investigation with Cold Case Desk and want to see how modern forensic techniques are solving cases that seemed impossible to crack, subscribe to stay updated on breakthrough discoveries that are changing everything we thought we knew about cold cases. The original investigation file was remarkably thick for that era, nearly 5 inches of reports, witness statements and search documentation. Chief of Police Harold Brennan had been thorough by 1958 standards, but the tools available to him were primitive compared to modern forensic capabilities. No cell phone records to trace, no security cameras to review, no social media footprints to follow. Just physical evidence, witness testimony, and intuition. Morgan found himself staring at the evidence inventory list, typed on an old manual typewriter with letters that struck unevenly against the paper. Item 4, female dress, cotton print, yellow floral pattern, torn at right side seam, unknown fiber samples collected. Item 5, fabric fragments, location, northwest corner of Maple Street and Highland Road, collected in evidence bags 5A through 5F. What struck him was not what was listed, but what the original investigators couldn't have known. Those unknown fiber samples contained genetic material that would remain undetectable for another 30 years. The fabric fragments held traces of skin cells that would become the key to solving Helen Patterson's disappearance, but only after technologies that didn't exist in 1958 could finally read the story written in molecules invisible to the human eye. Part 2. The morning everything changed. Catherine Patterson woke that Friday morning to the sound of her husband Thomas's heavy boots on the kitchen linoleum below. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves through the open bedroom window of their modest 2-story home located on Cedar Lane in Ashford, a small coal mining town in western Pennsylvania. The narrow street was lined with similar houses, each one home to families whose lives revolved around the rhythms of the mine whistle and the school bell. Everything about that morning would later be dissected, analyzed, and remembered with the painful precision that comes only after normal moments become evidence in an investigation. Helen had been unusually cheerful during breakfast, chattering about the upcoming school dance and the book report she had finished the night before. At 13, Helen was developing the confident nature that often comes with being an excellent student and a beloved older sister to her two younger brothers. She wore her favorite yellow floral dress, the one with the Peter Pan collar that her mother had sewn for her birthday in August. The walk to Ashford County Junior High School should have taken Helen exactly 15 minutes. She had timed it herself during 7th grade, walking the familiar route that connected Cedar Lane to the school building that sat adjacent to St. Michael's Catholic Church and the town library. The route took her along Cedar Lane to the intersection with Maple Street, then east for 4 blocks before turning north on Highland Road. It was a journey she had made hundreds of times, through spring rains and winter snow, past the Kowalski family's corner store with its red and white awning, beyond the old Garrett property with its overgrown hedges, and finally to the school where the residential streets gave way to the sounds of children's voices and the morning bell. Thomas Patterson kissed his daughter goodbye at 7:45 a.m., noting the time because he needed to catch the 8 o'clock shift bus to the coal mine. Catherine watched from the front porch as Helen walked down Cedar Lane, her school books held against her chest in the way that teenage girls carried them in those days. That image would become Catherine's most treasured and most torturous memory. Her daughter turning the corner onto Maple Street, one hand raised in a casual wave, completely unaware that she was walking toward an encounter that would define the rest of her short life. The first indication that something was wrong came at 3:30 p.m., when Helen failed to arrive home from school. Catherine had been preparing dinner, peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink, while Helen's younger brothers played in the backyard. Helen was always home by 3:45, responsible and punctual to a fault. When 4 o'clock came and went with no sign of her daughter, Catherine felt the first cold stirrings of fear. By 4:30, Catherine had walked to the school, only to find it locked and empty. She stopped at the Kowalski store, asking if anyone had seen Helen. Mrs. Kowalski remembered seeing Helen walk past that morning around 8, but hadn't noticed her return. The fear in Catherine's chest began to crystallize into something harder and more terrible. The schoolbooks were discovered at 5:15 p.m. by Daniel Kowalski, who had been sweeping the sidewalk in front of his family's store. He spotted them lying on their side near the intersection of Maple Street and Highland Road, scattered across the sidewalk as if they had been dropped suddenly. Helen's name was written in careful cursive on the inside cover of each textbook. Her English literature anthology lay open, its pages fluttering in the October breeze. The small lunchbox that Catherine had packed that morning sat beside the books, the sandwich still wrapped in wax paper, the apple still crisp. Chief of Police Harold Brennan had been maintaining law and order in Ashford for 26 years when Helen Patterson disappeared. At 54 years old, he had dealt primarily with bar fights, domestic disputes, and the occasional theft that came with coal mining communities experiencing economic decline. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for a missing child case, especially not one that would quickly escalate beyond the capabilities of his four-man department. The initial search began within the hour. Brennan assembled every available resource in Ashford County, his 3 full-time officers, the volunteer fire department, and the coal miners who had just returned from their shift and immediately joined the effort without stopping to change from their work clothes. By 6 p.m. on October 3rd, nearly 80 people were combing the area around Maple Street and Highland Road, working in systematic patterns through the residential neighborhoods and the wooded areas that bordered the town. The terrain made searching both methodical and challenging. The small town offered limited hiding places, but the surrounding woods were dense with underbrush, and the abandoned coal mine shafts that dotted the countryside created dangerous voids where a person could disappear. The searchers called Helen's name continuously, their voices carrying through the October twilight, mixing with the sounds of rustling leaves and the distant rumble of coal trucks on the highway. Catherine Patterson insisted on joining the search, despite Brennan's gentle suggestions that she remain at home near the telephone. Her anguished calls for her daughter created a haunting soundtrack that would remain in searchers' memories for decades. As darkness fell on that first evening, Brennan made the decision to contact the Pennsylvania State Police. The case had moved beyond his department's capabilities, and he knew that time was critical in missing person investigations. State Police Detective Lieutenant Andrew Walsh arrived from Harrisburg at 8:45 p.m., bringing with him crime scene technicians and bloodhounds borrowed from the state prison system. The dogs picked up Helen's scent from her bedroom and followed it along her school route, confirming the path to where her books were found, but losing the trail at the intersection where the books had been discovered. The FBI's involvement came on the second day, when Special Agent Robert Crawford opened a federal investigation under the assumption that Helen might have been transported across state lines. Crawford was a methodical investigator who had worked several kidnapping cases in Philadelphia, but the rural setting and lack of witnesses presented unique challenges. He established a command post in the Ashford town hall, installing multiple telephone lines and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The search expanded to include nearly 400 volunteers at its peak, drawing people from surrounding counties who had heard about Helen's disappearance on radio stations, broadcasting from Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. Coal miners suspended their shifts to join the effort, using their knowledge of local terrain to guide searches through abandoned mine shafts, creek beds, and wooded areas that outsiders might overlook. The Catholic Women's League organized meal rotations for the searchers and the Patterson family, while St. Michael's Church remained open around the clock for prayer vigils. Brennan documented everything meticulously, filling out reports in his careful handwriting and photographing potential evidence with the department's aging speed graphic camera. Every discarded cigarette butt, every tire track in the soft earth near the roadside, every piece of torn fabric caught on fence wire was collected and catalogued. Most would prove irrelevant, but Brennan understood that missing details could mean the difference between solving a case and watching it fade into the archives of unsolved mysteries. By the end of October, the intensive search had covered over 60 square miles. The FBI had interviewed more than 300 people, including every male resident between the ages of 16 and 70, within a 15-mile radius of where Helen's books were found. They had checked the backgrounds of recent parolees, transient workers who had been in the area during the fall season, and anyone with a history of contact with minors. But as November arrived and the autumn leaves fell to reveal woods that held no trace of Helen Patterson, the investigation began its inevitable transition from active search to cold case file. Catherine Patterson's obsession began with small rituals that seemed reasonable to a grieving mother. She kept Helen's bedroom exactly as it had been on October 3, 1958, making the bed each morning with the same chenille bedspread, dusting the collection of glass figurines on the dresser, and ensuring that Helen's homework assignments remained stacked neatly on her desk. The book report on Little Women that Helen had completed the night before her disappearance stayed open to the final page, her fountain pen lying beside the paper at the exact angle where she had placed it after writing her conclusion. In the first months after Helen vanished, this preservation felt like hope. Catherine told herself that Helen would return to find everything waiting for her, that maintaining normality was a form of faith that would somehow call her daughter home. But as 1958 became 1959 and then 1960, the unchanged room transformed from a shrine of hope into a monument to loss. Thomas Patterson began sleeping on the couch in the living room, unable to pass Helen's door each night and see Catherine sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Helen's favorite cardigan and whispering conversations with a daughter who wasn't there to answer. The annual pilgrimage to Chief Brennan's office became Catherine's most sacred ritual. Every October 3rd, she would dress in her Sunday clothes, walk the 8 blocks to the police station, and file a new missing person report for Helen Marie Patterson. The law didn't require annual filings for missing persons cases, but Catherine had convinced herself that constant pressure was the only way to prevent Helen's case from being forgotten. Brennan, and later his successor, Chief Robert Morrison, received these visits with patient compassion, even as the reports became increasingly detailed and somewhat detached from reality. By 1965, Catherine's reports included elaborate theories about Helen's disappearance that she had developed through extensive correspondence with other families of missing children across the Northeast. She became convinced that a network of criminals was systematically abducting young girls from small towns, transporting them across state lines for purposes she could never articulate but clearly feared. Her letters to the FBI grew more frequent and more desperate, filled with connections she had drawn between Helen's case and missing person reports from Ohio, West Virginia, and Maryland that shared only the most superficial similarities. The psychological toll on the Patterson family became evident to their community in ways that no one quite knew how to address. Thomas Patterson, a man who had been known for his quiet strength and steady reliability, became increasingly withdrawn. He began stopping at McGinty's Tavern after his shifts at the mine, sitting alone at the bar until closing time, unable to face the house where his daughter's ghost lived in her mother's rituals. Their marriage, which had been solid and affectionate before Helen's disappearance, became a careful choreography of two people trying to grieve in the same house without acknowledging that their grief had taken incompatible forms. Catherine's obsession expanded beyond the annual reports to include maintaining detailed correspondence with psychics, private investigators who promised results for money the Pattersons couldn't afford, and amateur detectives who contacted her after reading about Helen's case in true crime magazines. She converted Helen's room into an informal command center, covering the walls with maps marked with pins, indicating where other girls had disappeared, timelines written in her increasingly erratic handwriting, and photographs of men who had been arrested for similar crimes in other states. The community's initial sympathy gradually gave way to uncomfortable avoidance. Catherine's behavior at church services became unpredictable, sometimes involving tearful outbursts during prayers for the sick, and other times manifesting as inappropriate laughter during serious moments when her mind had wandered to some memory of Helen. The Catholic Women's League stopped including her in social functions, not out of cruelty, but because her presence transformed every gathering into an occasion for discussing theories about Helen's disappearance that had become increasingly disconnected from evidence or logic. Thomas Patterson died of a mining accident in 1976, crushed by a roof collapse in shaft number 7. The official cause was listed as accidental death, but everyone in Ashford understood that Thomas had been dying slowly for 18 years, worn down by grief and Catherine's refusal to accept that Helen was never coming home. Catherine received the news at home on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 18 years and 5 days after Helen had failed to return from school on another Friday afternoon. Detective Margaret Sullivan discovered the forgotten evidence box on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in July 2003, 45 years after Helen Patterson's disappearance. Sullivan had been assigned to conduct an inventory of the Ashford County Courthouse basement storage areas as part of a county-wide effort to digitize old records and clear space for new filing systems. The basement stretched beneath the entire courthouse building, a maze of concrete-walled rooms that had accumulated decades of legal documents, evidence boxes, and administrative files that no one quite remembered how to categorize. The Patterson case file sat in a deteriorating cardboard box that had been misfiled in a section designated for civil court records rather than criminal investigations. The box itself showed signs of water damage from a pipe leak that had occurred sometime in the 1980s, leaving brown stains along the edges and a musty smell that indicated prolonged moisture exposure. Sullivan nearly overlooked it entirely, mistaking it for another container of property deed transfers or estate probate documents that filled most of the surrounding shelves. When Sullivan finally opened the box, she found herself looking at a case that predated her law enforcement career by 2 decades. The original evidence inventory, typed on yellowed paper with a manual typewriter whose R key struck slightly higher than the other letters, listed 42 items collected during the initial investigation. Most were routine materials that had yielded no useful information: soil samples from the sidewalk where Helen's books were found, photographs of tire tracks that proved too degraded to match, witness statements that had led nowhere productive. But buried beneath layers of routine evidence bags and faded photographs was something that made Sullivan pause in the stifling basement air. Evidence bag number 4 contained Helen Patterson's yellow floral dress, the one she had been wearing when she left home on October 3, 1958. The dress had been torn at the right side seam, with the fabric separated along the stitching in a way that suggested sudden, forceful contact rather than gradual wear. More importantly, the evidence bag also contained several smaller envelopes labeled unknown fiber samples and fabric fragments collected at scene. The fiber samples had been collected by FBI technician Lawrence Chen, whose meticulous evidence collection methods had been noted throughout the original case file. Chen had used tweezers to remove fibers from the torn section of Helen's dress that appeared inconsistent with the dress material itself. Under the magnification available in 1958, these fibers appeared to be wool-based fabric in a dark grey or black color, possibly from a work jacket or heavy coat. But the technology to analyze these samples properly simply hadn't existed when they were collected. Sullivan found herself staring at evidence that had been waiting nearly half a century for forensic science to catch up with investigative theory. DNA analysis had become standard procedure in criminal investigations by 2003, and the techniques for extracting genetic material from fabric fibers had evolved dramatically even in the past 5 years. The Pennsylvania State Crime Laboratory had recently acquired equipment capable of analyzing microscopic biological samples that would have been useless to earlier forensic methods. The fabric fragments told a more complex story. Chen had collected these pieces from the ground near where Helen's books were discovered, some caught on a chain-link fence and others embedded in the cracks of the sidewalk. The fragments appeared to come from at least 2 different sources, pieces that matched Helen's yellow dress and several pieces that clearly came from different garments entirely. One fragment, barely larger than a postage stamp, showed what appeared to be a small tear pattern, with microscopic traces of what Chen had described as possible biological material. Sullivan carefully photographed each piece of evidence before resealing the containers according to updated chain of custody protocols. The basement storage had not been ideal for preserving biological evidence, but the cool, dry conditions had actually helped prevent the degradation that might have occurred in less controlled environments. She could feel the weight of possibility as she carried the box upstairs to her office, understanding that these forgotten fragments might contain the key to answering questions that had tormented the Patterson family for more than 4 decades. James Patterson was 4 years old when his sister Helen disappeared, young enough that his memories of her were fragmented and uncertain, filtered through the lens of childhood confusion rather than clear recollection. By 2021, when their mother, Catherine, finally succumbed to complications from Alzheimer's disease, James had spent 63 years living in the shadow of a sister who had become more myth than memory in their family's daily existence. Catherine's death came on a December morning when western Pennsylvania was locked in the grip of a winter that had lasted since November, with no sign of yielding. James found her in Helen's bedroom, where she had taken to sleeping during her final months as her dementia progressed. The room had evolved from a preserved shrine into something resembling a museum of obsession, with walls covered in maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten timelines that traced connections between Helen's disappearance and dozens of other missing person cases across the Northeast. The funeral was small, attended by the handful of Ashford residents who remembered the Patterson family from before they became defined entirely by tragedy. James stood beside the grave in St. Michael's Cemetery, where his father Thomas had been buried 45 years earlier, listening to Father O'Connor deliver a eulogy that struggled to find words for a woman whose life had effectively ended on the same October day that claimed her daughter. The priest spoke about Catherine's devotion and persistence, carefully avoiding any direct reference to the mental deterioration that had made her final years a source of discomfort for the community that had once embraced her family. After the funeral, James faced the overwhelming task of sorting through Catherine's accumulated materials. The house had become a repository for every document, photograph, and piece of correspondence related to Helen's case, organized according to a system that made sense only to Catherine's increasingly fragmented thinking. Boxes filled the basement, containing copies of police reports, letters to and from FBI agents, communications with psychics and private investigators, and detailed notes about television programs that had featured missing person cases with any superficial similarity to Helen's disappearance. But buried within Catherine's obsessive documentation, James discovered evidence of genuine investigative work that had been dismissed or overlooked by law enforcement agencies, overwhelmed by her more erratic theories. Catherine had maintained correspondence with families of missing girls across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, creating a network of shared information that revealed patterns no single jurisdiction had been able to recognize. Her maps showed clusters of disappearances that occurred during specific time periods in small towns served by similar highway routes, suggesting the possibility of a mobile perpetrator who had never been identified because the crimes crossed multiple jurisdictional boundaries. James had inherited his mother's determination, but possessed the emotional stability that 63 years of grief had gradually eroded in Catherine. He approached Helen's case with the methodical mindset of someone who had spent his career as an accountant, understanding that solving complex problems required systematic analysis rather than intuitive leaps. He began by digitizing Catherine's entire collection, scanning thousands of documents and photographs into a computer database that would allow him to search for patterns and connections that might have been invisible when scattered across physical files. The breakthrough came when James contacted Detective Margaret Sullivan, now retired, but still consulting on cold cases for the Pennsylvania State Police. Sullivan had kept the Patterson case file active in her mind, even after leaving law enforcement, occasionally revisiting the evidence when new forensic techniques became available. When James explained his systematic approach to organizing his mother's research, Sullivan realized that the combination of Catherine's investigative work and modern DNA analysis might finally provide the answers that had eluded investigators for more than 60 years. James's persistence differed from his mother's in crucial ways. Where Catherine had been driven by desperate hope and increasingly irrational theories, James was motivated by a desire to honor both his sister's memory and his mother's lifelong dedication. He understood that solving Helen's case wouldn't bring either of them back, but he also recognized that allowing the investigation to die with Catherine would mean that their suffering had served no purpose. If you've been following this decades-long search for truth with Cold Case Desk, consider subscribing to see how new forensic methods are finally providing answers to questions that have haunted families like the Pattersons for generations. Detective Richard Morgan received the phone call from the Pennsylvania State Crime Laboratory at 2:43 p.m. on February 12, 2024, 65 years and 4 months after Helen Patterson had failed to arrive home from school. Morgan had been working the Patterson case intermittently for 14 months, ever since James Patterson's persistent advocacy had convinced his supervisor to authorize the expensive genetic genealogy analysis that might finally identify the unknown DNA profile extracted from Helen's torn dress. The laboratory technician, Dr. Sarah Chen, spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that her words would reshape decades of unanswered questions. The genetic material recovered from the fabric fragments had yielded a partial but usable DNA profile that had been run through the combined DNA index system with no matches initially. But the newer technique of forensic genetic genealogy, which compared crime scene DNA to publicly available genetic databases used by ancestry research companies, had produced something unprecedented in the Patterson case, a family tree that led to a specific individual. Morgan felt his pulse quicken as Dr. Chen explained the methodology. The DNA profile had been uploaded to GEDmatch, a public database where people who had taken commercial ancestry tests could share their genetic information to find relatives. The system had identified several distant cousins whose family trees, when analyzed by genetic genealogist Dr. Rebecca Foster, converged on a common set of ancestors in western Pennsylvania during the 1800s. Dr. Foster had spent 8 weeks constructing detailed family trees for each branch, working backward through birth records, marriage certificates, and census data to identify living descendants who could have contributed the DNA found on Helen's dress. The family tree analysis had narrowed the possibilities to 2 men who would have been between 20 and 40 years old in 1958 and living within 20 miles of Ashford. One of these men was still alive and had voluntarily provided a DNA sample that eliminated him as a match. The other, the property, a small row house that had since been demolished, was directly along the route Helen would have taken walking home from school. Garrett had complete privacy in the residence, living alone after his mother's death in 1957. Morgan immediately contacted Ashford County Sheriff's Department to request all available records related to William Garrett and his properties. What he learned made him understand why the original investigation had never identified him as a suspect. Garrett had been questioned briefly in November 1958 as part of the routine canvassing of area residents, but the interview had been conducted by a single officer who found nothing suspicious about the young man who claimed to have been working at the coal mine during the afternoon of October 3rd. No follow-up investigation was conducted, and Garrett's name appeared only once in the thousands of pages of documentation generated during the massive search effort. The investigation into William Garrett's background revealed a pattern of violence against women and girls that had been hidden for decades behind the protective silence of small-town communities and the limitations of pre-digital record-keeping. Detective Morgan spent 4 weeks in February 2024 traveling between county courthouses, police departments, and newspaper archives across western Pennsylvania, piecing together a criminal history that no single jurisdiction had been able to see in its entirety. Garrett's first documented assault against a female occurred in 1959, less than a year after Helen Patterson's disappearance. Karen Mitchell, then 17 years old and working at a diner in Somerset, had reported that a man matching Garrett's description had followed her home from work on multiple occasions before attacking her in an alley behind her apartment building. Mitchell's description of her attacker included specific details about a distinctive scar on his neck from a childhood accident that matched medical records for William Garrett. But the investigation had been closed when Mitchell suddenly moved to Ohio and refused to cooperate further with police. The pattern continued through the 1960s and 1970s with remarkable consistency. Morgan discovered reports from Somerset County, Westmoreland County, and Fayette County describing similar incidents. Young women and teenage girls who reported being stalked and attacked by a man who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost in the rural areas between small towns. The attacks typically occurred along isolated roads during late afternoon or evening hours, and the perpetrator invariably fled when victims resisted or when other people approached. Most disturbing was the age range of the victims. All were between 12 and 18 years old, all had light-colored hair similar to Helen Patterson's, and all were traveling alone when they were targeted. Morgan's breakthrough came when he contacted Detective Andrew Walsh Jr., whose father had been the state police detective assigned to Helen's original case. The younger Walsh had inherited his father's case files when the elder detective died in 1995 and had maintained them in his attic as an unofficial cold case archive. Among these files was a folder labeled Similar Incidents, Unconfirmed Connection, that contained reports his father had collected but never formally investigated due to jurisdictional limitations and resource constraints. The folder contained detailed notes about William Garrett that had never been included in the official Patterson case file. Detective Andrew Walsh Sr. had become suspicious of Garrett in 1961 when a pattern of attacks in the area led him to re-examine the list of men who had been questioned during the original investigation. Walsh had conducted surveillance of Garrett's residence on several occasions and had documented observations about his behavior that suggested potential involvement in multiple crimes against young women. However, the surveillance had been unofficial and had never produced evidence sufficient for an arrest warrant. The most significant discovery came when Morgan obtained permission to search properties that Garrett had owned throughout his life. Garrett's son, Michael, who lived in Pittsburgh and had been estranged from his father for decades, granted permission for a complete search after learning about the DNA evidence connecting his father to Helen Patterson's disappearance. Michael had always suspected that his father was capable of violence, having witnessed his brutal treatment of Michael's mother throughout his childhood, but had never imagined the scope of William's crimes. The search of Garrett's final residence, a small house in Fayette County where he had lived from 1985 until his death in 2020, began on March 18, 2024, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs that had not been available to investigators in 1958. The house was scheduled for demolition, but the foundation and surrounding property yielded evidence that painted a horrifying picture of William Garrett's activities. Buried beneath the basement floor, searchers discovered a metal ammunition box containing items that could only be described as trophies, pieces of clothing, jewelry, and personal items that matched descriptions of belongings taken from multiple victims across several decades. Among these items was a small glass figurine, a delicate bluebird that matched photographs from Helen Patterson's bedroom collection taken during the original investigation. The figurine had been one of Helen's most prized possessions, a gift from her grandmother. Its discovery provided physical evidence that connected William Garrett not only to Helen's DNA, but to her actual presence at his property. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team and provided James Patterson with the first concrete proof that his sister's case was finally approaching resolution. The evidence against William Garrett became overwhelming during the spring of 2024, but the finality of his death 4 years earlier meant that the traditional concept of justice would never be fully realized. Detective Morgan found himself in the peculiar position of building an airtight case against a man who would never stand trial, never face his victims' families in court, and never be forced to account for the decades of suffering he had inflicted on the communities surrounding Ashford. The forensic analysis of items recovered from Garrett's property revealed connections to at least 9 other missing person cases spanning from 1959 to 1984. DNA evidence linked Garrett definitively to 4 of these cases, while personal belongings found in his buried collection provided circumstantial evidence connecting him to several others. The glass bluebird from Helen Patterson's collection was just one piece in a macabre treasure trove that included a high school class ring belonging to Susan Walsh, who had disappeared from Westmoreland County in 1967, and a distinctive silver locket that had belonged to Emily Rodriguez, a 15-year-old who vanished while walking home from a church youth group in Fayette County in 1973. Morgan spent countless hours reviewing the original investigation files from these related cases, understanding now why the crimes had never been connected during the years when Garrett was actively preying on young women and girls. The jurisdictional boundaries that separated Somerset County from Westmoreland County, Fayette County, and Allegheny County had created investigative silos that prevented law enforcement agencies from recognizing the pattern of a single predator moving systematically through rural Pennsylvania. Each case had been worked independently by dedicated investigators who lacked the communication networks and database systems that would have revealed the connections between Garrett's crimes. The most devastating revelation came when Morgan discovered how close the original investigation had come to identifying Garrett as Helen Patterson's killer. In December 1958, Detective Andrew Walsh Sr. had obtained a warrant to search Garrett's residence based on witness reports that placed Garrett in the vicinity of Maple Street during the afternoon hours when Helen disappeared. However, the search had been delayed for 3 weeks due to administrative complications, giving Garrett sufficient time to remove any obvious evidence from his property. The search, when it finally occurred in early January 1959, had focused on the house interior and immediate grounds, but had not extended to any potential burial sites or hidden storage areas where evidence might have been concealed. Additionally, the search warrant had been limited in scope, authorizing investigation only for evidence directly related to Helen Patterson's disappearance rather than the broader pattern of crimes that Garrett had been committing. Morgan learned that Detective Walsh had maintained unofficial surveillance of Garrett through the mid-1960s, documenting his movements and noting correlations between Garrett's activities and the timing of attacks on young women in the region. Walsh's personal notes, discovered in his son's attic archives, revealed a level of suspicion about Garrett that had never been formally documented due to the limitations of evidence collection and legal procedures available at the time. The case files also revealed the tragic irony that Garrett's criminal activity had actually escalated after he successfully avoided detection for Helen's murder. The confidence gained from evading the massive investigation into Helen's disappearance had apparently convinced Garrett that he could continue attacking young women without consequence. His subsequent victims had paid the price for the investigative limitations that had allowed him to remain free after killing Helen Patterson. By April 2024, Morgan had assembled sufficient evidence to close 10 separate cases that had remained unsolved for decades. The Ashford County District Attorney formally declared that William Garrett would have been charged with first-degree murder in Helen Patterson's death if he had been alive to face prosecution. Similar declarations were issued by prosecutors in the 4 other counties where Garrett's crimes had occurred, providing official recognition of his guilt, even though traditional justice was impossible. James Patterson received the call from Detective Morgan on April 22, 2024, exactly 65 years and 6 months after his 4-year-old world had been shattered by his sister's disappearance. He was sitting in his living room in State College, Pennsylvania, reading through some of his mother's old letters, when his cell phone rang with the news that would finally close the longest chapter of his family's tormented history. Morgan's voice carried the weight of both triumph and tragedy, as he explained that the Pennsylvania State Police had officially closed Helen Patterson's missing person case. The DNA evidence, combined with the discovery of Helen's glass bluebird among Garrett's hidden collection, provided conclusive proof that William Garrett had abducted and murdered Helen on October 3, 1958. Morgan spoke carefully, understanding that the words he was choosing would become James's permanent memory of the moment when 65 years of questions finally received their answers. The news brought James a complex mixture of relief, grief, and anger that he struggled to process. Relief that the uncertainty was finally over, that his mother's lifelong obsession had been vindicated, and that Helen's memory could be honored with truth rather than speculation. Grief for the sister he barely remembered, and for the parents who had died without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Anger at the decades of suffering that could have been prevented if the original investigation had been able to connect the evidence that ultimately solved the case. Morgan arranged for James to view the evidence that had been recovered from Garrett's property, understanding that seeing Helen's glass bluebird would provide a tangible connection to his sister that he had been missing for more than 6 decades. The viewing took place in a conference room at the Pennsylvania State Police headquarters in Harrisburg, where James sat across from Detective Morgan and carefully examined the small figurine that had once stood on Helen's bedroom dresser. The bluebird was delicate porcelain, painted in shades of blue and white that had faded slightly during its decades of burial, but remained recognizable as one of the collection that Helen had treasured. James had no direct memory of the figurine itself. He had been too young when Helen disappeared, but he remembered seeing it in photographs his mother had kept, and he had heard Catherine describe the collection countless times during her obsessive recounting of every detail of Helen's life. Holding the recovered bluebird in his hands, James felt connected to his sister, in a way that had been impossible when she existed only in family stories and faded photographs. The formal closure of Helen's case allowed James to finally make arrangements for a memorial service that had been impossible while her fate remained unknown. The service was held at St. Michael's Catholic Church on June 7, 2024, exactly 65 years and 8 months after Helen's disappearance. The small sanctuary was filled with people who had known the Patterson family, participated in the original search efforts, or simply wanted to honor the memory of a girl whose story had become part of their community's history. James spoke during the service about the importance of persistence and the power of modern forensic science to provide answers to questions that had seemed forever unanswerable. He thanked Detective Morgan, the Pennsylvania State Police, and the community members who had never stopped caring about Helen's case. Most importantly, he announced the establishment of the Helen Patterson Memorial Fund, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons in rural communities and advocating for improved communication between law enforcement jurisdictions. The fund would use donations collected in Helen's memory to provide training programs for rural law enforcement agencies, giving them access to modern forensic techniques and interjurisdictional communication systems that could prevent future cases from remaining unsolved for decades. James understood that he couldn't bring Helen back, but he could ensure that her death would contribute to solving other families' mysteries and preventing other communities from experiencing the prolonged suffering that had defined his family's existence. Following the memorial service, James worked with the Ashford County Historical Society to create a permanent exhibit documenting Helen's case and the investigation that finally solved it. The exhibit, titled Helen's Journey from Tragedy to Truth, opened in October 2024 at the County Museum. It included photographs of Helen, artifacts from the original investigation, and detailed explanations of how modern forensic genealogy had cracked the case after 65 years. The exhibit served multiple purposes. It honored Helen's memory, educated the public about advances in forensic science, and provided a space for other families of missing persons to find community and support. Detective Morgan used the Patterson case as a teaching tool, presenting at law enforcement conferences across the country about the importance of evidence preservation and the potential for cold cases to be solved decades later, using technologies that don't yet exist. He emphasized the meticulous work of the 1958 investigators, particularly FBI technician Lawrence Chen, whose careful collection of fiber samples had made the DNA breakthrough possible 66 years later. Those investigators did everything right with the tools they had, Morgan would tell audiences of police officers and forensic specialists. They couldn't have known that the evidence they were collecting would sit in a basement for half a century, waiting for DNA technology to be invented. But because they collected it properly and documented everything meticulously, we were able to give the Patterson family answers. The case also highlighted the dark reality of how many of William Garrett's victims might never be identified. The items found in his buried collection included personal belongings that couldn't be matched to any known missing person cases: a hairbrush, several pieces of jewelry, photographs of unidentified young women. These artifacts suggested that Garrett's crimes might have extended beyond the 10 cases that investigators had been able to connect to him. Morgan established a dedicated tip line and website where families of missing girls from the 1950s through 1980s could submit information that might connect their loved ones to items recovered from Garrett's property. As of late 2024, the investigation remained open for these potential additional victims. For the Ashford community, Helen's case brought a measure of closure to a tragedy that had haunted the town for generations. The corner where her books were found had been informally known as Helen's Corner for decades, with older residents still lowering their voices when they passed the spot. After the case was solved, the town council voted to install a small memorial marker at the intersection of Maple Street and Highland Road. The brass plaque, mounted on a granite stone surrounded by flowers that community members maintained year-round, read, "In memory of Helen Marie Patterson, August 14th, 1945, October 3rd, 1958, beloved daughter, sister and student. Her light continues to guide us toward justice." The memorial was dedicated on October 3rd, 2024, the 66th anniversary of Helen's disappearance. James Patterson attended the ceremony, along with dozens of Ashford residents, Detective Morgan and representatives from the Pennsylvania State Police. A children's chorus from the middle school that now occupied the site of the old junior high school sang "Amazing Grace" as James placed the first bouquet of yellow roses, Helen's favorite flower, at the base of the memorial. In his remarks at the dedication, James spoke words that resonated with everyone who had been touched by Helen's story. "My sister Helen was 13 years old when her life was stolen from her. She never got to go to her first school dance, never graduated from high school, never fell in love, never became the teacher she dreamed of being. My mother spent 63 years searching for answers, and my father died without ever knowing what happened to his little girl. But today, we can finally say that Helen has come home. Not physically. We will never have that closure, but in truth, in justice, and in memory, and perhaps that's the best homecoming we can give her now." The resolution of Helen Patterson's case sent ripples through the cold case community across the United States. Families who had spent decades without answers began reaching out to law enforcement agencies, asking whether similar DNA analysis might solve their own long-dormant cases. The Pennsylvania State Police received hundreds of inquiries in the months following the announcement of Helen's case closure, and other states began re-evaluating their approach to decades-old evidence storage and testing. The case also sparked renewed interest in forensic genealogy as a tool for solving cold cases. While the technique had gained prominence through several high-profile cases in recent years, including the capture of the Golden State Killer, the Patterson case demonstrated that the methodology could work even with partial DNA profiles extracted from evidence collected more than 6 decades earlier, before DNA science even existed. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lab technician whose work had been crucial to extracting usable DNA from Helen's dress, published a paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences detailing the techniques used in the Patterson case. The paper became required reading in forensic science programs across the country, illustrating how persistence, proper evidence preservation, and evolving technology could combine to solve seemingly impossible cases. Detective Richard Morgan continued working cold cases for the Pennsylvania State Police until his retirement in 2026. The Patterson case remained the most significant achievement of his career, but it also opened doors to solving 17 other cold cases during his final years of service. He often credited Catherine Patterson's obsessive documentation and James Patterson's systematic organization of that documentation as essential factors in solving Helen's case. "Most of the time we talk about how law enforcement solves cases," Morgan said in an interview for Cold Case Desk in late 2024. But the Patterson case reminds us that families are often the ones who keep these investigations alive. Catherine Patterson was dismissed as obsessed, maybe even mentally unstable, by some people in her community. But her instincts were right. There was a pattern. There was a predator moving between jurisdictions. She saw connections that law enforcement missed because we were working in silos. Her work mattered, even if she never lived to see it validated. James Patterson devoted his retirement years to advocacy work through the Helen Patterson Memorial Fund. The organization successfully lobbied the Pennsylvania legislature to pass the Cold Case Evidence Preservation Act of 2025, which mandated standardized protocols for storing biological evidence from unsolved cases and required periodic review of cold cases when new forensic technologies became available. The law, informally known as Helen's Law, became a model for similar legislation in other states. The fund also provided financial assistance to families seeking private DNA testing for cold cases when law enforcement agencies lacked resources to pursue testing. By 2026, the fund had helped facilitate DNA analysis in 37 cold cases across 6 states, resulting in identifications and closures in 12 of those cases. Perhaps most importantly, the fund established support groups for families of long-term missing persons, creating community spaces where people like Catherine Patterson would no longer be isolated in their grief and obsessive searching. These groups, meeting monthly in locations across Pennsylvania, provided both emotional support and practical guidance for families navigating the complex process of keeping cold cases active and advocating for continued investigation. As for Helen Marie Patterson herself, her memory lived on not just in the memorial marker at the corner where she disappeared, but in every cold case that received renewed attention, every family that found answers after decades of uncertainty, and every law enforcement officer who approached forgotten evidence with the knowledge that truth, however long delayed, was still worth pursuing. The photograph of Helen from her last school portrait, the one showing a bright-eyed 13-year-old girl in a Peter Pan collar, her whole life ahead of her, was duplicated and distributed to forensic science programs and police academies across the country. Beneath the photograph, a caption read, "Helen Patterson waited 66 years for justice. How many others are still waiting?" It was a question that continued to drive investigators, forensic scientists, and advocates forward, ensuring that Helen's tragedy had transformed into something more than just another cold case file gathering dust in a basement. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder of persistence, and a testament to the truth that no matter how much time passes, every victim deserves to be remembered, every family deserves answers, and justice, however long delayed, is always worth pursuing. This has been a Cold Case Desk investigation. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel to follow more cases where modern forensic science is finally bringing closure to families who have waited decades for answers. Helen Patterson's case reminds us that it's never too late for truth, never too late for justice, and never too late to bring someone home.